The sneeze reflex, a natural defense reaction against foreign particles and pathogens such as bacteria and viruses. A defense reaction with a risk of infection for the human respiratory tract. Like tiny pirates, the pathogens board the mucous membrane and cling tightly to it. This process is called adhesion, and it is just the beginning. The viruses forge their way towards the cells and enter them. It is like a chain reaction. Once inside, the viruses force the cells to exclusively produce new viruses, which in turn attack other cells where they multiply explosively. The result? An acute infection of the respiratory tract.
At first, the symptoms are quite harmless. A tickle in the nose, a scratch in the throat. Then the situation gets more complicated because this is a descending infection. It goes on to affect the larynx and the bronchial tubes, and only then does the patient go and see a doctor, which means that in daily practice, we're usually dealing with a fully developed disease.
Acute bronchitis is one of the most common conditions a family doctor has to deal with. In Germany, patients seeing a doctor due to a common cold or influenza infection account for no less than 650 to 850 million euros per year in expenses. To therapists, this is a challenge which keeps repeating itself year after year, because an inadequate therapy, or no treatment at all, may have severe consequences for the patient.
Acute bronchitis and the approach to treatment should be taken seriously right from the beginning. In 30% of cases, bronchitis will turn chronic, involving the risk of developing asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is the main problem when the condition is left untreated, meaning that therapy must start early.
In practice, however, the process of choosing the right treatment is often a source of misunderstanding. The hope for swift recovery from the patient's point of view is complemented by the deep faith in the universal remedy, antibiotics, a common misconception.
Those cases in which antibiotics are the right choice for treatment of bronchitis are extremely rare, because in 90% of all cases, bronchitis is caused by viruses, and viruses are not susceptible to antibiotics. It's thus malpractice to treat 90% of acute bronchitis cases with antibiotics.
And yet, this is exactly how it is done as part of standard practice in Germany, regardless of the hazards involved not only for society, but also for each individual.
The crucial point is that any therapy with antibiotics breeds resistance to antibiotics, right from the very first dose. This resistance develops in the patient's intestinal flora and in the skin flora. In the meantime, resistance to antibiotics has become one of the most serious infection-related problems worldwide. Not too long ago, the WHO publicized the fact that worldwide, more patients die from infections caused by pathogens resistant to antibiotics than from AIDS. This is a statistical fact which should really make us stop and think.
The standard practice of prescribing antibiotics is also routinely applied to children with acute bronchitis, who are actually regular visitors in doctors' surgeries during the cold season.
Children usually suffer a lot more from respiratory tract infections than adults, because their respiratory passages are smaller, and when they swell and become congested with mucus, breathing problems are much more common. Preschoolers, in particular, will sometimes have between 8 and 12 infections per year, which is quite a pain in the neck for their parents, as the mothers or fathers will have to stay home from work, depending on the individual family model. So this is actually an issue of considerable social impact.
As there are more and more families with 2 working parents today, the pressure on the labour market also affects the way parents deal with their children's frequent respiratory tract infections.
The parent takes the child to the pediatrician looking for an efficient solution. The pediatrician knows that a virus infection as such is quite natural. The child is supposed to fight against the virus, to identify the virus, so that next time around, the same virus won't make the child sick again. However, frequently neither the patients nor the therapist have the patience. Their reaction will be, I definitely don't want to run the risk of this turning into a severe purulent bronchitis or pneumonia, so let's give the child some antibiotics as soon as possible with any negative consequences associated with it.
The main reason why antibiotics are often used too early but unnecessarily is the fear of a bacterial superinfection, which is indeed serious but fairly rare. This is a tough and long-lasting condition, starting with an inflammation of the mucous membranes. The removal of mucus is hampered by evident flaws in the carpet of cilia. Too many cells have already died. The mucus accumulates and thickens. The airways become congested, resulting in a tickle in the throat and an urge to cough. For the bacteria, some of which can always be found on the mucous membranes, the situation could not possibly be any better. Up to this point, the body has been able to keep them under control. Now, however, in the accumulated mucus, they gain the upper hand, as this is the perfect environment for them to proliferate. But there are ways to keep this from happening.
There are, of course, plenty of alternatives for antibiotics in natural medicine. For instance, there are herbal remedies with the same or similar mechanisms of action as antibiotics, which means they have anti-infective effects. To these drugs, the bacteria have not yet learned to develop resistance, and this is the key point. Plants are much older than man. They've been around for billions of years, and before plants there were bacteria. They are even older. Thus, in a manner of speaking, there has been a constant struggle between bacteria and fungi on one hand, and plants on the other, ever since the world began. The bacteria and fungi are trying to kill off the plants, just as they're trying to kill us humans. The plants, however, over billions of years, have developed an arsenal of natural substances in defense against the fungi and bacteria. Thus, many plants have succeeded in developing substances which, fortunately, we are now able to use to our own benefit, as the bacteria have not learned to develop any resistances against them. And this is really fantastic.
Even under the most adverse climatic conditions and attacked by millions of microorganisms in the soil, plants still manage to survive. One such plant that braves microbial loads as well as severe changes in climate is Pelargonium pseudoides. The roots of this South African species of geranium have special powers which were highly appreciated even by the ancient natives.
And now, of course, we have the situation that as our classic antibiotics are losing their efficacy, for instance, due to the development of resistances, we're increasingly looking for new options. So now, basically, we're once again looking for old traditional forms of treatment. This is, in a manner of speaking, the rebirth of herbal remedies.
It was a European who more than 100 years ago experienced its unique benefits firsthand. In 1897, Charles Henry Stevens from England, suffering from severe tuberculosis, made a journey to South Africa. It wasn't the climate, however, which cured him in the end, but a 4-month therapy with a brew from the boiled roots of Pelargonium pseudoides. It was Stevens who subsequently established this plant in English and continental European medicine. Thus, as early as 1920, more than 800 patients were successfully treated with a preparation of Pelargonium pseudoides by the Swiss physician Séchaille. This has been documented in a comprehensive and detailed publication. About 30 years ago, the Dr. Wilmar Schwabe company developed the liquid special extract EPS 7630 from the roots of the plant. For many years, this raw material could only be obtained from plants collected in the wild. But then, the company developed a biological culture method, which by now provides most of the roots for EPS 7630. In some regions, however, such as the Eastern Cape and Lesotho, Pelargonium is still collected in the wild with special permits from the authorities. The company attaches great importance to the fact that this is done by skilled local collectors, in accordance with applicable criteria of sustainability. Even though EPS 7630 is not covered by the International Convention on Biological Diversity, the corporate group voluntarily engages in a wide variety of projects in those regions where the wild plants are collected, aiming for an even balance of benefits. These include, for instance, projects for knowledge transfer with regard to cultivation know-how and research findings, but also for supporting the education and training of young scientists and promoting various social projects in the local communities. After 3 to 4 years, when the active constituents in the roots of the pelargonium plant are fully matured, it is harvested and brought to Germany for processing. At the production site in Karlsruhe, the drug is then made into a herbal medicinal product, which is licensed in Germany under the trade name of Umcaloabo.
EPS 7630, or to use the Latin term Pelargonium sidoides extracts, are among the best studied phytopharmaceuticals we have today. As far as efficacy is concerned, the situation with regard to studies is excellent. To my knowledge, there are close to 10,000 patients involved in studies, and almost half of these in controlled trials. What's particularly important for this indication is that it has a lot to do with children. There are also studies available which involve children.
In order to get a marketing authorization for medicinal products, the first thing one has to do is ensure a consistently high level of pharmaceutical quality. With herbal medicinal products in particular, this is a major challenge because these products consist of a multitude of ingredients which quite obviously complement each other in their mechanisms of action. Thus, the total extract is typically more effective than the individual substances as such.
In herbal medicine products, we have not only one structure, but actually several fractions. And each of these has a specific pharmacological effect. Thus we commonly use the term pleiotropy, that is from pleios, meaning multiple, and treptine, meaning to address. So with all the different individual fractions, I'm addressing different receptors or different mechanisms, which means I'll get a completely different profile of effects. And this is a special characteristic of EPS 7630. It has a partly antiviral, antibacterial, and anti-inflammatory effect. It has a corresponding effect on the mechanisms which trigger or perpetuate a cold. And this is why phytotherapy is so fascinating, because these are multi-component mixtures with several individual fractions. So I've got a specific mechanism with each fraction and don't have to give 3, 4 or 5 different things in combination. That's the difference, and that's what makes natural medicine so fascinating.
This is why an accurate analysis of individual extract components is of essential importance. Not only with regard to the mechanism of action, but also in terms of tolerability. With EPS 7630, this applies in particular to coumarin derivatives, of which it contains small amounts.
EPS 7630 contains 7-hydroxycoumarins, but not the coumarins we have in anticoagulants, such as fenprocumin or warfarin, for example. In their structure-effect relationships, they differ in 2 significant places, namely at the C3 position and at the C4 position. In one position, there is an OH group, in the substances with an anticoagulant effect, such as marcuma, for instance, and the side chain, which accounts for absorption. Typical of EPS 7630 is that it has no effect on coagulation. An interesting aspect is that coumarins are metabolized in completely different ways. Through the inoculation of umcalin, which is the primary substance in EPS 7630, with human liver cells, it was established that no toxic metabolites are formed in the degradation process.
The exact pharmacological profile of effects was investigated by scientists from the University of Freiburg in Germany. As is already apparent from their ongoing research, the anti-infective effects observed so far are directed against a broad spectrum of pathogens.
We did a total of 7 studies in order to find out what effects does this substance have. And one would have to say its effects are primarily immunological.
Thus, for instance, it has been proven that the risk of adhesion of viruses and bacteria was substantially reduced by a protective film coating on the mucous membrane cells. So, in a manner of speaking, their attack is thwarted right at the very surface. But even if, for lack of such prevention, the viruses have already gained ground on the mucous membranes, EPS 7630 is still effective. It activates the body's natural defense system. Natural killer cells are mobilized. They enter the mucous membrane cells that have been seized by viruses and kill them off. This deprives the virus of its basis for reproduction, while also leaving it susceptible to the body's defense system. This is where the macrophages come in, so-called scavenger cells, which are also powered to top performance by EPS 7630. Like the tentacles of an octopus, the evaginations of these cells move in on the intruders from all sides, leaving them no chance for survival. But the scavenger cells don't stop at that. They also ingest and destroy any other cells that are injured or damaged until the mucous membrane is thoroughly cleaned of any debris that interfered with its normal function and can recover. Bacteria don't stand much of a chance either when exposed to this natural extract. Its active substance renders them unable to multiply any further. Stimulated by EPS 7630, the cilia of the mucous membrane simultaneously increase their frequency by up to 40%. Mucus is removed more efficiently, the nose begins to run, the swelling of the mucous membrane subsides, the airways open up, the infection is under control. For a medicinal product to obtain a marketing authorization in Germany, studies regarding its pharmaceutical quality and mechanisms of action must be complemented by trials with human patients to confirm its efficacy and tolerability. Thus, more than 3,800 patients were involved in controlled double-blind trials and more than 5,400 patients in open-label trials and post-marketing surveillance studies. Specifically, 3 placebo-controlled trials conducted in adults with acute bronchitis were instrumental in obtaining the marketing authorization. The assessment of efficacy was based on the severity score of typical bronchitis symptoms. Over the course of 1 week, the total score, which included such cardinal symptoms as cough, sputum production, rales, chest pain and dyspnea, decreased significantly faster with EPS 7630 than with placebo. This is an essential factor with regard to the patient's ability to return to their workplace sooner. The fact that the period of working inability is reduced by more than 2 days with EPS 7630 as compared to placebo can be regarded as substantial evidence in this context. Similar results were obtained in a trial involving adults who had been suffering from acute sinusitis for at least 8 days. The target parameter in this case was the severity score for typical sinusitis symptoms.
Patients had to have a score of more than 12 points to be included in the study. They were at least moderately, but more likely severely or even very severely affected. Then they were examined after 7, 14 and 21 days. The primary endpoint was the change in this symptom score on day 7 as compared to the placebo group. And what they found was a highly significant reduction in the mean symptom score as compared to the placebo. Another important aspect, for socio-economic reasons as well as from the individual's own perspective, is the patient's working ability. After 1 week, 62% of patients in the EPS 7630 group were able to go back to work, as compared to only 36% in the placebo group.
The study did not limit itself to sinusitis symptoms like headaches and a stuffy nose.
In this study, they went to the extra effort of not only evaluating the symptom score, but also taking X-rays of each patient at the time of study entry and again after completion. Actually, an X-ray of the sinuses is not really necessary for a diagnosis of sinusitis. This is a clinical diagnosis based on various factors. You don't need an X-ray image for it. For the purposes of the study, however, it certainly made sense that even in an independent assessment, they were actually able to say, in all those patients that were included in the study, a maxillary sinusitis was clearly apparent in the X-rays as well, and it got better afterwards.
The studies conducted with children posed a particular challenge. For 70% of all medicinal products used in pediatrics, there are no specific pharmacological studies available. With EPS 7630, the situation is different. In 2 placebo-controlled trials involving more than 450 children and adolescents, a very good efficacy and tolerability was demonstrated.
The Schwabe company went ahead and did placebo-controlled trials starting from the first year of life. The youngest child in these large studies, with a total of 800 children, was just barely 1 year old. And that was when it became quite obvious that EPS 7630 is very effective, that it heals infants, youngsters, as well as adolescents much, much faster. After only 3 to 5 days, they felt fitter as compared to the placebo group. We have the immunomodulatory effect. We take advantage of that to speed up recovery. But the immune system still has to deal with the pathogen, so that the memory effect of the immune system will still be developed.